Hello, my name is Aaryn Christensen, and I'm here to talk about my programming contest submission, Graphical Gunner. The initial plan of Graphical Gunner is to try to only use matplotlib and avoid using Pygame for anything graphical based. So these are actually the only lines that Pygame is used inside of the game, creating the window, checking for keyboard inputs and mouse inputs, blitting the figure from Matplotlib onto the Pygame screen, and then being able to close it. The second thing I limited myself to is not being able to import anything into the game if it wasn't created by the script itself, so no extra images or files. My initial strategy was to just make the foundations and fundamentals first and then build everything on top of that, just to avoid having to deal with rewriting huge chunks of code because something wasn't built initially correctly. So in version 0.1.1, I initially made this point fix function that was able to translate anything from Pygame to matplotlib and back and forth. And then I also tried to code this basic save file loading system that didn't work the best, but it was just an attempt at the time to see if it was possible. I also created a rendering function which held all the things that caused rendering to happen. Then in version 0.1.2, I created the first graph, which was just a linear. This was a super inefficient way of doing it, so I'll refine it later in 0.1.5, and then it'll work much better by that point. In 0.1.3, I created just some basic enemies to be able to shoot with that graph. I created damage checking for both the player and the enemies and reloading to the main graph. In version 0.1.4, I added the inventory and a calculation for anything that you wear, a couple items just to test that out, and the ability to pause the game to be able to change your items around. In version 0.1.5, I did actually refine that linear to make it work much better by using this new graphing type, and I attempted to add a parabola which didn't work initially. Then in 0.1.6, the parabola did work after a lot of code. I think it was a week or 2 weeks of just trial and error, and I finally got the parabola to work using these extraordinarily long lines which actually go off the screen, which I'll show you in a Desmos graph. So here I am inside of the Desmos graph. We have the linear graph up here. It is just a simple purple line, and it's able to be rotated using A, horizontally moved using B, and vertically moved using C. The same graph applies for this y equals one, and then this next one is the parabola, which is just a squared version of the linear. And then finally, these two right here are that y equals version of the parabola, which is able to do rotation, horizontal movement, and vertical movement. So after implementing both of those graphs, I actually wanted to be able to hit enemies with them, so I added run wave to be able to spawn enemies at the start of a wave, enemies update for them to be able to move and damage me, and roll item to be able to actually get an item if I kill the enemy. So roll item is just a super basic script which just randomly gives me an item out of an item pool. So in version 0.1.8, I improved the save file, which fixed a lot of those issues, and I added item descriptions because a lot of the items that were dropping were not really known what they did. Now in version 0.1.9, I added a new enemy type called the Grapher, which was able to shoot you from a long-range graph, just a simple linear. It used actually the same equation that the player used if they were shooting a linear, which I just called enemy graph gun instead of graph gun. It had this atrocious piece of code here, which was how it was actually graphing, so I had to fix that later, but for now I used it because it was close enough. I also added keybinds at this point and started to fix the saving again because there was even more issues with it. Then in version 0.1.10, I added a little bit of storyline to the game to really make the game be able to cycle properly, and then I also added absorbers to the game because I just wanted more enemies inside of it. In version 0.1.11, I finally fixed that roll item like I said I was going to do a couple of slides ago, and this allows it so that depending on the rarity of the item, it has a higher chance of dropping, it can't drop items that don't exist in loot pools, and it doesn't give you random empty loot pools. There was also an improvement to movement by adding dashing, but you can't use the dash until this next one, where in version 0.1.12, dashing was unlocked from the storyline on Meetup 3, which is on Wave 10. Then in version 0.1.13, I added another enemy that spawned past Wave 10 called the Annihilator, and then I gave him a graph and improved that graphing script that I said was an atrocity a couple of slides ago as well. In version 0.1.14, I finally started Add the Boss. This is the bare bones of it, where he only has one attack and one little roll pool. I fixed a ton of bugs at this point too that caused the frames to double, which was super nice. In version 0.1.15, I added more attacks to the boss and caused him to spawn better, and making him spawn on wave 25. I also added some extra story to the game that I'll go over on the next slide, and I added death animations. So here's that story I was talking about. There's story on waves 20 and 25, which is just super simple, and I also made the boss more sight readable so that you're actually able to dodge him and not just get hit by every single one of his attacks. Finally, I ended on version 1.00, which I basically just fixed all of the bugs, removed all the useless code that was still sitting there, reduced the bulk of it, and just made it run better. I added some better graphics on the title screen because I noticed that the buttons were a little hard to use in the older versions, and I added a new game button instead of only the continue button because I found it annoying that you always had to delete your save file. That's basically it. Thanks for listening, and I hope you have fun with the game.